So good afternoon. My name is Triipp, and I will be discussing The Lotus Eaters by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Today in this video, I'll be covering The Lotus Eaters. This poem is thought to be Alfred Lord Tennyson's retelling of the famous old story of the Lotus Eaters, which shows up in Book 9 of Homer's Odyssey. If you're an undergraduate student like myself, you probably read this 2 years ago in your early English courses, and you might not be just up to key with everything that happened in Book 9, but don't worry about it because Alfred Lord Tennyson taught us everything that we need to know about what goes on in that time. The story in this poem are about some sailors who find themselves in a new and strange land, and they decide to eat a plant, which makes them want to stay there forever. Can be interpreted as a drug, and I would also say it may as well be a drug. So the poem begins. We got a crew of sailors that are approaching land and eventually arriving in a new and strange country. In this new country, the sailors find a lazy tropical place full of streams and mountains and waterfalls, and the way it's described is absolutely gorgeous. Upon arrival, sailors meet the natives called the Lotus Eaters, who are a mysterious bunch of dark faces who look both gentle and solemn. And that's straight from the speaker's description of the Lotus Eaters. They're dark faces and solemn, gentle-looking people. Yeah, it's left to interpretation as to where you think they're really located. But with the people, they're carrying their favorite food, and which is an enchanted plant called the lotus. Without much convincing, a group of the sailors try the lotus, and it has a strange effect on them. All who tried the lotus became instantly very sleepy and lazy. They plop down on the beach and refuse to move, insisting that they are tired of working all the time and want to stay in this new tropical place and just relax. The rest of this poem from this point is spent with the sailors talking of how tired they are, and how even though they still think of and miss their families and home, it would be too much work to get back there. So that's basically just a quick synopsis of what everything that goes on during The Lotus Eaters by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I'm going to further this video and kind of get into more of my examination of what I found through reading and close examination and reading a couple outside sources. So after my close undergraduate examination of the poem, I found I could argue that there were really two speakers for this poem. So speaker one, he really gives the introduction, the first 5 stanzas to set the scene, and they tell the audience about the two parties we are dealing with in this poem. I would consider the first speaker to be anonymous, third-person narrator. We as the audience do not know who he is or what his perspective is on the island or what even takes place with him on the island. When a reader or scholar looks back on the first speaker, he becomes a very dynamic character because of his lack of personality. Everything else seems to be described, and I'll get into some more of the imagery and personification and use of figurative language to really describe everything in completeness. So the speaker's lack of description really hits home and makes him much more dynamic than some of the sailors and others who we found to be the second speaker. The speaker's calm description and a very objective look at things makes the lotus-eating sailors seem more crazed and wild just because of the lack of knowledge we have on this first speaker. So as I've already alluded to, I would argue the other speaker is the sailors. They take over after the first 5 stanzas, and they're the speaker for the rest of the poem as they sing their choric song. As the audience, we don't know much of anything about the sailors. They are a faceless narrator. We do not know their age or what they look like. Making the connection to the Odyssey, the audience can assume they are battle-proven, middle-aged men who've been at sea for a really, really long time. But we have to remember this is just an assumption. We're making a comparison of 2 different works. Tennyson never comes out to us and says, like, these are my middle-aged sailors who just proved themselves in battle and now they're coming back to really just hit this island real quick and see this new strange land. That is never stated. One thing we do get from Tennyson, though, is we learn a lot about the sailors' feelings and their desires. We know an awful lot about how tired they are. And we also know about how after eating the lotus, they no longer want to return to their hard work of life at sea. We also learn a little bit about their past and knowing that they have families and servants and holdings of land. These men don't seem to be servants themselves or of a lower class. These seem to be very upper class men with, they got slaves and wives and children and people counting on them to get home. But after they eat the lotus, they don't feel like leaving. They're going to stay right there and just finally kind of do what makes them feel happy. And at the time, just relaxing and doing their own life makes them happy. So when looking at the author and his view of the speaker, I think the author seems to view the speaker critically with his use of language in describing their newfound laziness. So this is kind of like a straight up literal interpretation of mine, is that he sees the speakers very critically as the sailors. He views them as very lazy humans, and that's why he uses such descriptive language in describing the laziness. This view of laziness is a very literal interpretation. As I've already said, it's straight up from the words. What I get is that he views them as very lazy, and that's a critical interpretation of his. But I also find it easy to argue that this piece is a comment on the author by the author. Upon further investigation, I found that Tennyson produced this piece before he was famous, and after reading that, I found a strong case that the author was using the speaker to make personal reflection on feeling lazy in his personal life because he had not yet accomplished everything that he was going to accomplish, and really hadn't accomplished anything at this point in his life. So in class, we discussed how he had to drop out of Cambridge and go back and kind of be the man of his household because of his father and older brother, and his friend had to basically help him push himself into the scholarly, academic, and literal world. So he hasn't really had success yet, and everything seems to be constantly falling down on top of him. All of his life goals, he produces his first couple works, he doesn't take off and become the huge superstar that he will become immediately. So this work is produced early on in his career, and this is a reflection on himself. He's looking back like, man, I am really lazy, and nothing seems to be going my way. I can really visualize when, after knowing all these backstory and things about his personal life that we've learned through class and through outside sources I consulted, Tennyson really is commenting on his own life here, I feel. It's a personal reflective narrative, and this is where Tennyson is using the speaker to comment on his own life and kind of just tell himself that, I need to quit being lazy and motivate himself to work harder and do everything he needs to do. So dealing with conflict, I say this poem is very, very diverse and full of conflict. But it's mainly between the speaker and natural forces. The lotus is a natural plant, making them lazy and not want to turn their hard lives at sea. So, you got the lotus, which is, as I said, it's natural, and it's combined with the sailors, and this is what's really stopping us. The real internal conflict is they eat this lotus, and they no longer want to do what society expects them to do. So that would bring us into what I believe a more overarching conflict would be the speakers and social expectations of the time to be the man of their household and work a day in and day out to support everyone besides themselves. These men really feel like they haven't done anything for themselves, and that's why when they finally get this lotus in this calm, relaxed setting really takes in, and this plant forces them to be like, hey, everyone wants me to do this, but I'm going to do what I want to do and relax and stay here and really be the man in my own arena and be the man of my own life. This conflict really reaches a crisis when the sailors decide not to return home and stay relaxed in their new tropical home. This realization I would also call the conclusion to the crisis, because building up to that, we're really getting a description of the setting, a description of the plant and the people, and once they start eating it and more start trying it, we have the crisis of we're not going back, we're staying right here. So this personal realization is not resolved. The sailors are left right there on the island of the Lotus Eaters. The structure of this poem is iambic meter. Iambic meter is poetry containing iambs. An iamb is such a metrical foot having two syllables, the first unstressed or weak and the second stressed. Many people know of Shakespeare writing in iambic pentameter, which is something completely different. Don't get them confused. This is iambic meter. There are also several cases and lines of regular rhyme in this poem, just normal, straight poetry, A, B, just regular rhyme throughout this poem. Alfred Lord Tennyson does a great job of using a lot of types for figurative language throughout this poem. In the first 5 stanzas, he uses a lot of personification. Some examples of personification are line 6, where Tennyson uses a simile to personify the air, comparing it to a breathing person. Or in line 8, where Tennyson uses another simile to describe the lazy water falling compared to smoke drifting downward. All of this sets a really looped in. The audience is trapped in a slow, laid-back vibe. Alfred Lord Tennyson also uses constant repetition, like the exclamation point starting both the first and the second stanzas, and the repetition found in lines 3 and 4 of the afternoon, contributing to the dream-like feeling, influencing the audience and feel like we're stuck in a loop. As I've already said, all of his use of figurative language really makes us feel like we are stuck, and we're also in this lazy kind of setting where it's like we can't escape. We have no bearing of what time it is. We feel like constant afternoon, and we're right there with the sailors and the whole lazy feeling. Because of repetition, the eternal feeling of afternoon never leaves, and most repetition found in this poem can be directly related to an eternal stuck feeling to influence the audience. There are also many examples of consonants in line 2, like us shoreward, us shoreward soon. Consonants is the recurrence of similar sounds, especially consonants in close proximity to each other. The speaker uses a bunch of similes and metaphors to create very distinctive imagery for the audience. Almost all the natural features are described with lots of adjectives and personified with a similar metaphor as described earlier in this video. I will not waste your time and go back through those lines, but those comparisons that I made earlier are also ways that Alfred Lord Tennyson builds imagery to really give an active setting. Like you can almost feel and see as you're reading the poem, like this very, very majestic, calm setting. So I believe this poem really drives home two main themes, and the first being nature as living being and a natural influencer. The scenery throughout this poem is personified to give it life. The setting is also a natural influencer because its relaxed atmosphere, along with the fruits of its being, convince the sailors never want to leave. I also believe another theme to this poem is time and its strangeness. The poem makes the audience feel as if we were stuck in an eternal afternoon. I've said this multiple times. It's really one of the drive home points I would like to make. This poem conveys that time is a man-made construct and has no bearing on our lives. Anyone can decide to plop down on a beach and relax forever, and the entire construct of time would disappear. So that's really everything you need to know about the Lotus Eaters by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I personally really like this poem. Our readings of In Memoriam in class really made me motivated and want to do more Tennyson work. That's why I chose his work for this video project. Those are my drive home points. I want to thank you for watching my video.